I'm Cristina Arroyo from the Valley Stream Justice Project, and welcome to the Valley Queens podcast, in which we address systemic inequities in our town and our island. This month, we will be talking to Noah Casas. Noah is a legal fellow at the New York University's Furman Center. After earning his JD from Yale Law School, he worked with the New York City Law Department, the District Court of Massachusetts, and the United States Court of Appeals for the Third District. His research currently focuses on land use and local government law, with an emphasis on the institutional structures of local governments. Tonight, Noah and I will be discussing exclusionary zoning, which will help us elevate the conversation, especially surrounding the recent apartment development proposal on Franklin Avenue by the Valley Stream Long Island Railroad. We will be talking about the pros, the cons, but mostly ways forward toward a more inclusive and equitable Valley Stream. So, let's go. All right. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast, in which we discuss structural inequities in Long Island and how they affect real people in small towns and big towns. And Noah Casas, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and you just published in 2020, I believe, a paper titled Ending Exclusionary Zoning in New York City Suburbs.
That's right.
Why specifically New York City suburbs? What is unique about them in terms of zoning, or not unique at all, actually?
Yeah, I'd say there's two things that make the New York City region, and especially the in-state suburbs of New York, really unique with respect to exclusionary zoning. So the first is that the problem is worse here than basically anywhere else in the country, with the possible exception of the Bay Area. And the second is that the state has done the least of any of our peer states in the Northeast or on the West Coast to do something about it. So in all of these other states, there have been efforts, not always successful, but efforts to try and claw back some of that zoning power where it's being used to exclude. And in New York, we've basically not done that. The legislature hasn't acted on this. So we've got a problem that's really intense, and we've got a need for action. So that's why I wanted to write this paper.
Oh, okay. So basically what you're saying is that there's some field experiments and some solutions out there that have been tested and tried.
Yeah,
So we don't have
solution
to
might be
start
an
anew.
overstatement, but we certainly have learned a lot about what works, and other states have made progress. So New Jersey, Massachusetts are longtime leaders. California has been moving very aggressively in recent years, and I think we're going to see exciting results. Oregon as well. They just essentially got rid of single family only zoning across the entire state. So that's a huge move. So there's a lot of action. There's legislation in states as small as Vermont. There's legislation in Nebraska, right? So New York is due for this kind of thing.
Okay, so you mentioned doing away with single family zoning, single housing family zoning. Before we continue, can you kind of give us like a quick rundown of what does an exclusionary zoning mean? Is there such a thing as non-exclusionary zoning, or zoning that's like exclusionary neutral, or however you want to say it?
Well, that's a great question, because I'm not sure there's a bright line at which point zoning becomes exclusionary. It's all zoning is about telling people what they can and can't build, and how much they can and can't build on a piece of land, and what they can and can't do with it. So you can build 2 stories, you can build 3 stories, you can build industrial, you can build residential. So you're always excluding something, and to some extent, you're always excluding. You could always build a bigger building. You could always house more people in your town, right? Any amount of zoning puts some limit on that. So the question that we're trying to ask is, how much is too much? And that's a judgment call. But I think we can say with a lot of confidence that what we see across most of the New York State, in the inner suburbs of New York, so Westchester, Nassau, Suffolk, up into the Hudson Valley, is that we've gone well past the how much is too much point. So some things you look for when you're looking for what's exclusionary zoning. Can you build apartment buildings? because apartments are often cheaper than single family homes, and they're also accessible to a larger set of people. Maybe someone with a disability who needs a wheelchair, needs an elevator for a wheelchair. So you want to see multifamily, large lot sizes. Do you need to buy an acre of land to go with your house? That's the government basically forcing you to have a big backyard and to pay for it, right? So that's going to increase the cost of housing. And then all the little things that start to accumulate. How big do your side yards have to be? How big does your rear yard have to be? How much parking do you have to provide? How tall can it go? Can you have a backyard cottage for your grandma or to rent out? There's a million little rules. And then the other important set of rules is process rules. So it might be that you're allowed to have that 3-family building, but you have to go to site plan review, and you have to go to architectural review, and you have to go to the zoning board. And by the time you've gone through 4 layers of review, nothing is getting through, right? So we talk about discretionary review, the opportunity for the town or the village or the neighbors to come in and say, we don't want that, even though it meets the definition of what we're saying is allowed. And that's a powerful tool for exclusion. It's one of the most important ones, especially in this region.
So in terms specifically of Long Island, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or what you see around New York City suburbs, let's keep it to that, obviously, because that's what your paper was about. Exclusionary zoning, you're saying that it's limiting the types of residences and the types of kind of like buildings that you can put in the town. In terms of how does it manifest in Long Island? Do those exclusionary zoning ordinances, beyond limiting types of building, how do you see it manifesting, excluding specific groups of people, or does it not?
Oh, it absolutely does. So the New York City region is the second or third most segregated region in the country. Second or third, depending on whether it's Black-white segregation, Hispanic white, or Asian white. So we're number 2 or number 3 on each of those metrics. And our zoning code is one part of why. It's not the only part of that fair housing story at all. I'm sure you saw the Newsday investigation about discrimination by real estate brokers on Long Island. So there's a lot of other mechanisms entrenching that segregation. But one of the things that furthers that is when you have income inequality and wealth inequality. If you're pumping up the price of housing in some places and you're allowing apartments or cheaper housing to exist only in a few set communities, you're going to entrench segregation in that way. You're going to lock in who lives where. If you're just capping the amount of change that's happening in your building stock, that makes it harder for people to move. If you've got segregated housing patterns in the past, that slows down the process of integration. So a big part, hard to say how much, but a big part of the reason that we're so segregated as a region, and Long Island is the worst of the worst on this, is because our zoning has locked in the built environment of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
And obviously Long Island, and including Valley Stream, has seen a huge demographic shift since the early 2000s in terms of who's moving in, who's having children, what kind of kids attend the schools, all those sort of things, including transportation. And Valley Stream has the Valley Stream train station, which is a stop at the Long Island Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in a prime area, and it's also bordering Rosedale, Queens.
Okay.
So it's quite interesting because I guess my question is, it does limit in terms of, even though we're a very diverse town, it seems that the people who can afford to live there are not distributed evenly across the races. Like, you basically have to have a lot of money to move in there if your parents or you don't have a house in which your grandparents are already there.
Right.
So I guess my other question is, besides racial segregation, which exclusionary zoning may perpetuate, what other types, if there are any?
Oh, I mean, or segregation by income and by class and by wealth is a huge part of it, maybe even more so than racial segregation at this point. What we've seen over the last however many years is that racial segregation has gone down unbelievably slowly, but it has gone down since sort of its peak in the 1960s and 70s. At the same time, segregation by income and also by education have just gone up and up and up. So that's another important piece of it. I actually just wrote a paper on how in some places the way we structure our suburbs through sort of restrictive zoning has real gender equality implications.
How
So,
so?
all kinds of ways.
I'm
So,
very,
but
very
one of the ones that's,
interested.
yeah, one of the ones that's really important is if you're lengthening the distance that people have to commute to go to work, um, you're causing a trade-off between sort of who's going to go downtown to where wages tend to be higher, and generally you want one parent who's going to be a little more available to home, working closer to home, can pick up the kids, can let the plumber in, whatever needs to happen. And given the way there's wage inequality, that ends up falling on women a lot more. So what we see in economic studies is that as you lengthen those commutes, the gender wage gap increases and women's labor force participation goes down. So that's another mechanism, not the most important one. Sort of the race and income segregation issues are much more acute, but at the end of the day, when you take a land use system designed in the 1920s and sort of implemented through the 1950s and 60s, you're importing so many of the ideologies of those eras.
No, and that makes sense. But here's the thing. I remember you started your paper with the Fair Housing Act, post MLK.
Yep.
So some people would say, well, the Fair Housing Act happened, therefore, we don't mean to segregate by race or by income or by gender. So what's the, so if we're doing everything right, then what's the problem? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So first of all, I think we shouldn't be pretending that there's not outright intentional discrimination in the housing market, especially on Long Island. When we have this Newsday article that has, just a shocking percentage of real estate brokers who are, ostensibly trained on fair housing laws, explicitly steering people, explicitly treating, white home buyers and Black home buyers completely differently in terms of the documentation they need. We know that there's overt discrimination in housing markets, but also there's a lot of sort of structural features that maybe aren't intentional, but we set up our system in a way to basically make it that white people don't have to be intentionally racist to reap the benefits of structural inequality. That's a lot of what our system of local government is designed to do, to sort of cordon off certain kinds of resources and say the people who are here get to decide what to do with these resources, the school, the train station, and they can allocate them as they see fit. But you've drawn the lines in such a way that some people are in and some people are out.
And I guess that's just the result sometimes. So what about, so people are accustomed to this kind of zoning. It's status quo. You
Absolutely.
A lot of people don't feel it. A lot of people do feel it, the negative impact of it. But a lot of people don't feel it. They're just like, this is just how things are. Things are good,
And there are benefits too. Let's not, pretend that there aren't nice things about, an all single family neighborhood. A lot of people want to live that way. So there's benefits and costs.
Exactly. So that's what I wanted to get into, is sort of like when you start, for example, when you start implementing changes in zoning, especially to sort of like encourage inclusionary zoning. So that's allowing for building more apartment buildings, right?
Yep.
Letting more people in. People say, well, what about overcrowding, for example, in Long Island suburbs? Is that something that should concern us?
So I want to answer the question about overcrowding in a second, but one of the things that's so important about the politics of this stuff is that it's unbelievably controversial every time you get to an individual site, an individual building, even at the town level, right? And politicians know this and they run away in the other direction so often. But when you have this conversation about values at the state level, it tends to come out a little differently. So I actually don't want to sort of accept the premise that this is, super controversial. So Massachusetts has a statute that limits exclusionary zoning. It allows the state to override local zoning in towns that don't have enough affordable housing. And that was put up to a referendum, I think about 15 years ago now. And it survived easily, about 2/3 of the vote. That doesn't mean that every time one of those affordable projects goes into the suburbs, it isn't, fought tooth and nail. But when we get together and sort of listen to our better angels and say, do we think that local communities have the right to exclude? Most people want to say no. So I think that the politics of this are actually better than we're primed to think, because what we've done is we've set it up so that the people who have this fight are the people who are angriest about it. The people who are on that block who are going to bear what they think are the negative consequences of that development. And we don't elevate the voices that are going to benefit from it. We don't elevate the values that sort of motivate change. So I think that if we actually change the way we have the conversation, it doesn't need to be, it's still going to be controversial, but it doesn't need to be the kind of controversial that it sometimes feels like it is as a political issue. So I wanted to start off by saying that. But on the question of overcrowding, not a problem on Long Island. Long Island is one of the slowest growing places, suburban places in the country that's attached to sort of a high demand metro. So put aside the Rust Belt where people are, really moving away. But one of the things we did is we looked at the suburban counties all up and down the Northeast corridor around Boston, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and then California. 3 of the 4 slowest growing places of all of those areas in the entire country are Nassau, Suffolk, and Westchester. It's the bottom of the bottom. And what you see is that, on Long Island, the population aged 25 to 54, so you sort of your like core working age population, is declining, right? So there's not a problem of overcrowding. There's a problem that, the region is emptying out as people or aging, really, because they're not creating new housing opportunities for growth and for change. The school districts also, enrollment is way down on Long Island. Put aside COVID. Yeah, I don't know how the numbers have changed.
Yeah.
My guess is it's gone up some places, down other places.
It's right now it's all over the place. We can't.
Yeah, go back to 2019 though. School enrollment was way down on Long Island because of the exact same trends I was saying. People who are 25 to 54 are also parents. So overcrowding might be a concern somewhere, though I'm pretty skeptical in almost all places that are not, like super environmentally fragile. But on Long Island, there's room to grow. We have in this region the best transit infrastructure in the country. Right? You talked about the Long Island Railroad. Long Island Railroad is a more extensive, commuter rail network than basically anywhere else in this nation. Right? Like if we can build anywhere, we can build in Nassau County.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, okay, so if overcrowding is not a problem, how is bringing new people in or having more people in your town who are more diverse in terms of racially, economic background, let's say gender, or any culturally in any other way, how is that beneficial for a town on Long Island?
Yeah, so one is that, if the population is declining, that actually puts sort of a tax burden on everyone, right? If you're running the same schools, but there aren't people to pay them, or there aren't people with income, that can hurt the tax base. It can definitely hurt the commercial vitality of the area. If you don't have enough people, you don't have patrons for your restaurants and your shops. I think that's something that we see in a lot of the suburbs of New York, is sort of struggling downtowns or struggling malls, things like that. Some of that is Amazon and e-commerce, but you can help those businesses by adding customers. So that's a way that it can be beneficial. I think the benefits of just diversity for its own sake are really important, but you might not be able to convince people with that argument.
Money arguments.
Arguments tend to be, unfortunately, where the rubber meets the road on this kind of thing.
Well, that's odd. It's not like we live in a totally capitalist economy.
Right.
Like
Oh, the
what?
environment is the other one that I think is so important to talk about. When we going back to the Long Island Railroad, what is the best way to reduce our carbon emissions as a country and especially as a region? You know, using the transit infrastructure that we already have, building densely so that you're not heating and cooling, a giant single family home, but an apartment that's smaller and it's insulated by your neighbors.
Yeah.
This kind of transit oriented development is so important for reducing our carbon footprint. And it is a big part of the reason I got into this work, in addition to all the other things we've been talking about.
So a lot of people are concerned about developers and them
Mm-hmm.
taking advantage of opportunities to build apartments and make it like the city. A lot of people talk about, oh, like it doesn't have that community feel, like it doesn't have that suburb community feel. I guess like I always want to quantify everything. So I'm like, when do you get a suburb or like a town in a suburb to cross over and become more urban? Like, is there a line? Like, how do people just identify this? And how do we know if, we're losing our town charm? How do you address those concerns?
Yeah, that's a very hard one to address because I don't think it's terribly rooted in sort of any particular, built form or objective reality. It's about the feeling of change in a neighborhood. So, I did a few minutes on Google Maps looking at Valley Stream, and I saw some gorgeous old apartment buildings, Tudor, probably built in the 1920s. And my guess is no one worries that those buildings don't fit into the community because those buildings have been there for 100 years.
Right.
And that's true of a lot of the suburbs that I've spent time in. There's great apartment buildings that are just part of the fabric of our communities because they were built before the zoning really got put in place or got tightened up. And in contrast, the new apartment building seems like a real threat. So it's hard to get people not to worry about the change of their community because what they're worried about is change, which is a very human feeling, right? Like we all feel that. I know in the town I grew up in, changes at all. I have to remind myself that that's okay. But I think that's a big piece of what's going on is that change, the new version of the exact same thing is scary, whereas the old version of it is, we look right past it.
So we've talked a lot about sort of how exclusionary zoning like try to discourage it, right? Can bring out some positive effects on the town and some benefits, but like let's be realistic, like nothing is all good.
Sure,
Once
yeah.
you implement it, what are the pitfalls? What are the things that we should be aware of, or things that we should, when it starts happening, maybe we should address so that they don't get worse?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so what are the downsides of growth? One that people worry about a lot is tax revenues. So the new development is going to increase tax revenues, just all things being equal, but there's going to be new people who require new services. On Long Island in particular, everything is funded by the property tax, so this takes on, extra significance. One thing that's important to do here, I think, is another reason thinking regionally and thinking at the state level is so important, because it can be true at the local level, that new development is going to shift the tax burden onto existing homeowners in town or existing renters. But at the state level, it's basically not true at all that having new development and more people is going to be a hit to the taxes of the state. I mean, it can be, but that's really, really unlikely. So if this is something that we're doing together as a region, I think that's one way we can really mitigate that concern. People are always concerned with traffic. More people means more cars, and that's true. That's why I think focusing on transit's really important. We've got the capacity to do that. There's been huge investments in the Long Island Railroad over the last decade. East Side Access, third track. So this is really about taking advantage of the investments that we've already put in and making the most of those billions of dollars in transit improvements that we have. You have to, make sure that you do your due diligence on water and sewer, but that's all doable, right? Like, but don't screw that one up. The engineers won't let you. You don't have to worry. But the big pitfall is that people, move to a community thinking it would look one way and they don't want it to look a different way. So some people have really argued for what they call missing middle housing. So that's, don't put in large new apartment buildings, but, a 2-family, 3-family building that, still is detached. It looks like the other houses on the block, but, there's, it's a duplex or a triplex. And that's sort of a gentler change to the community. The downside to that is that it's harder to put in below market rate affordable housing into a building like that. It's harder to get the real density that you want for taking advantage of transit, for sort of those environmental benefits. So there's pros and there's cons to sort of doing that, but I think that's something that a lot of people are talking about.
And I think you're like touching upon a really interesting part, which is like a lot of people think about this as black and white. No pun intended. That just happened. Black and white, like it's either like giant apartment buildings or single family homes, and there's no middle ground. And I think that what you were talking about was really interesting because a lot of people aren't concerned in our town about traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what you're saying is kind of like, there's ways to mitigate this. There's ways to strategically use these exclusionary, can I say inclusionary zoning?
I would caution against it because people have deemed a very particular policy inclusionary zoning that is not exactly the opposite of exclusionary zoning. So when you think about programs that say, okay, if you build a new development, you have to set aside 10% or 20% of your units as below market rent. That's generally called inclusionary zoning with like a capital I and a capital Z.
Mm-hmm.
So I try and avoid that phrase just because it ends up confusing people, because it could mean what I just said, even sort of the set asides, or it could mean trying to open up your zoning so there's more kinds of housing that you can build. So I just avoid it.
No, I understand that. So let's talk about like opening it up a little bit more to people. Like, for example, traffic concerns. If we're going to build apartment buildings, yes, there's going to be more people. Do they have to have cars? Do they have to use their cars all the time? Not necessarily. Perhaps you can build apartment buildings around a transportation hub.
Yeah, and make sure there's a grocery store. Make sure but like there is a grocery store. There's a grocery store everywhere. Not everywhere. There are real food deserts, but like this is probably a solvable problem.
Okay, so there are ways. So in your paper, you talk about your proposed solution. Well, not solutions. I'm not going to say solutions. Recommendations.
Yeah, the tools we've got in our toolkit.
So can you list them and tell us which ones would be best for suburban neighborhoods outside of New York City?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying I'm not going to tell you which one's best because I don't think we know enough to say. I think we know enough to say a few that don't work so well. And I think that what we can do as a state and as a region is try and find our own way to mixing and matching some of the best elements from each of them. So with that caveat, one of the earliest sets of policies, Massachusetts passed one, it's called 40B in 1969, I think. Again, right after the Fair Housing Act was passed. And Connecticut and Rhode Island have both copied that. Illinois has its own similar version. And what this does is it says, if your town doesn't have 10% of its housing affordable meaning below market rate, subsidized to a certain extent, and a developer wants to come in and build mixed income housing, with a certain amount of it affordable, that developer can ignore local zoning. And it's a question of not whether it complies with the zoning code, but basically, can the town show that there'd be a real concrete harm from that development, which often there could be, right? That's going to cause flooding, or that's going to, truly screw up the traffic patterns. But the town can't just say, we don't want it. They have to sort of have the goods. So it shifts the burden, and it also streamlines the process. So basically what these policies are doing is saying, in towns that don't have enough affordable housing, if you want to build affordable housing, you get a streamlined path and sort of a way around the exact details of local zoning. That's one model.
Can I ask you though a question about that?
Yeah.
Because that sounds a little bit like the Long Island Workforce Housing Act.
Not that much, actually.
Okay.
The Long Island Workforce Housing Act is really about when you're building housing that you already are entitled to build under the zoning process, you can get a little bit of extra density in exchange for a little bit of affordability.
Oh, so it's not as much.
Yeah, and it doesn't really override the local zoning at all. It sort of says once you've gone through the zoning process, there's this bonus, but it doesn't change the underlying zoning. Whereas the Massachusetts, Connecticut model is a path around the local zoning. So the town can say, we only want single family, or you need to have 150 parking spaces for those apartments. And these statutes give developers of mixed income housing a way to just say, we don't need it, or we're going to build apartments here, and we can. So that's one model.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to focus on this because it's something that is affecting our town, and it's not actually, because it's supposed to encourage workforce affordable housing, except the parameters of what's defined as affordable is not because it's set on household income.
Yeah, so the Long Island Workforce Housing Act, I haven't met anyone who really thinks of it as a smash success, putting it lightly. So there's some real technical problems with the drafting that makes it unclear when it applies, how it applies, that suggests it applies, very small numbers of units are affected. And what's defined as affordable is 130% of area median income, which is a really high number. This is not a significant intervention in any way, shape, or form. Maybe it is better than the status quo, maybe it isn't even, but it doesn't move the needle.
Yeah, in our town, it hasn't moved anything.
So, and then I think I saw a report from maybe 10 years ago that said they couldn't identify a single unit that had been built under it. That's probably changed since then, but the point is, you can basically treat it as if it doesn't exist. That's not actually true, but it's so insignificant.
So you were saying which other models?
Yeah, so then there's California is the other one that California is another one that's existed for a really long time. For a long time, their model did not work, but they've changed a lot in recent years. So what they do is it's a planning process. So they say every town has to create a plan for how they're going to provide enough housing for projected population growth at each income level. So, they would say, town X, you are going to grow, 10%. And we think that, of that 10%, this much will be high income people, this much will be middle income people, this much will be low income people. Show us where the housing is going to be to accommodate that growth, which sounds good, but there were some major problems with enforcement, with the way they projected those numbers. So for instance, they looked at your past growth to project your future growth. So all you had to do was not grow to continue not growing. So famously, Beverly Hills in the last cycle of this planning process only had to build 3 units. So, and there's research basically suggesting this didn't change things at all. But it's created the framework for law after law after law after law that the California legislature has passed going back, say, 5 or 10 years now, because what they can tighten up the enforcement, they can tighten up the projections, they can tighten up each of it, and we're about to see this machine kick into gear. So I'm optimistic that it's going to create some real change moving forward, but it hasn't yet. And Washington and Oregon also have sort of similar planning processes.
It seems that that's sort of like a plan that's more proactive in terms of population growth and integration rather than reactive.
Yeah, exactly. The Massachusetts model, that is sort of the biggest flaw, is that it relies on a developer coming in, wanting to build, there's enough profit on the table that they can cross-subsidize the affordable units, and in that case, I'm pausing because Massachusetts has made some changes to make it more proactive. What I described as sort of the original model, and they've adapted over time to sort of put in an ability for towns to create their own more proactive plan. So all of these models have converged in interesting ways, because they're learning from each other. So California's borrowed elements from Massachusetts and vice versa. So I'm sort of laying out the archetypes here. But yes, proactive and reactive is exactly right.
So if it's more proactive, it requires some planning beforehand, right? And designated zones and things like that. Then that would reduce the probability of spot zoning, which a lot of people are very concerned about in terms of corruption. And sort of like, favoritism, like, oh, we'll just build this here because I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that might just be operating on a different axis, because you can always put the favor into your plan.
That's not wrong.
So yeah, that's the California model. Then New Jersey is another really important one. And then there's like a couple more that I'll talk about. So New Jersey sort of combines some elements of both. And this is under something called the Mount Laurel Doctrine that was originally created by the courts there, but has been really implemented and refined subsequently by the legislature. So like Massachusetts, it's focused on sort of integration and affordable housing. Like California, there's sort of this projection process of assigning each town their share. So it's the fair share of affordable housing. Each town has to do it. And it's been really protected by the judiciary there. So this is probably the most forceful intervention of any of them because it's really had the support of the courts. So there's a lot to learn from there, but the details of Mount Laurel are incredibly complicated.
Okay.
It's changed every few years. So that's the broad strokes of it. Oregon just basically preempted local zoning where that zoning required you to build single family homes. So everywhere in the state, other than a few, really small towns, really rural areas, you have to allow 2-unit homes at a minimum. And in many parts of the state, you now have to allow 4-unit homes. They're working on refining the details of, sort of like, all the architectural pieces
Right.
of it, the setbacks and whatnot. But the basic idea is they said, look, we're not saying you have to live in a 2-unit home, but we're saying if you want to, you have the right, everywhere. We don't think that it's legitimate to require people to only have a single family home on their property. So that's sort of the most direct model. And a lot of states have been moving in that direction in their legislative proposals. And you can do that with anything. You can do that with lot sizes. You can do that for apartment buildings. And all of these proposals are out there, and some of them are being enacted into law. But Oregon's sort of the simple, big one. And then the final one is Pennsylvania, which is sort of like a keep it simple, stupid model. And what it says is every town has to allow a mix of housing types. So you can have single family detached houses and apartment buildings, or it can be townhouses, or it can be whatever, right? But you can't just have single family homes. And that's been very effective in terms of getting more apartments built, but it hasn't been effective in terms of getting below market rate units because it's not trying to. Oh. Right. So that's just sort of like the simplest, like, please build more apartments. And it's worked. So all of and then there's a final category of trying to give people fiscal incentives, just saying, if you rezone, we'll pay you, like direct check into the town treasury, and then we'll pay you more every time you build a housing unit. That's had an interesting effect, which is low, moderate income towns have leapt at the opportunity because they need the money, and because they're interested in revitalization. So they've done it a lot around, so like a downtown, it kind of fallen on hard times, use it as an opportunity to rezone that, get some cash from the state, and that's a good thing. But the high income suburbs, where exclusion is the worst, they don't need the money, they don't want the money, they don't take the money.
So that makes sense, because I was going to ask you, does it work better to provide incentives or the opposite to
Yeah,
somehow?
carrots or sticks.
Exactly. And it seems
There's,
it depends on the context, the town, the demographics in terms of income, all that stuff.
yeah, but if we're talking about sort of the most exclusionary, high income places, you need a carrot, you need a stick, and it needs to be a big stick.
A big, okay, that makes sense. So you basically you're saying the way we can open up towns for people, for different kinds of people, right, is to move it up to the state.
I think so, yeah.
Some people have been talking about hyper localization in terms of zoning.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So there's a set of proposals that have been going around very recently, trying to say, maybe what we should do is have this be sort of negotiations among like your immediate neighbors, the people on your block or something like that. And if you get half the people on your block to agree, you can build something bigger on your property. And the idea here is like, maybe your neighbors, maybe you can make a deal with your neighbors. Maybe everyone can realize that, like, Jim's a nice guy, or he's going to do something responsible with his property. We can trust him. And there's some logic to that, but I am very skeptical personally. There's really great research by a team of political scientists at Boston University. They studied exactly who showed up at basically every zoning hearing in Massachusetts. And they coded where they lived, their political party, their gender, their race, like everything about them. They managed to pull all this data from all these different sources. And one of the things that they found is that the people who show up are overwhelmingly, they live like 1 to 2 blocks away from the proposed development, because that's who really cares, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're overwhelmingly opposed. So what we've done already is basically empower the immediate neighbors. It already is hyper local, because the zoning hearings, they care what the neighbors think. They care what the people who show up think. So I think that kind of describes the status quo, not in a formal legal sense, but in a practical one. And I don't think it's a good one for sort of fair and open housing.
Okay, so I want to give you one last question, which is a very, maybe you can answer it, maybe you can't answer it, maybe there's no answer to it, but you're saying in order for towns to open up to different groups of people, right? And actually like perpetuate the idea that doesn't matter what your skin color is, how much money you make, everyone sort of has the right to be able at least to try to live in the suburbs if they don't want to live in the city, or to enjoy the small town feel, right? If this has to be done statewide level, like what can local governments of villages and towns do in the meantime to address these issues? Is there anything?
Absolutely. I mean, right now, local governments have all the power, right? I'm optimistic about the politics at the state level, and I think that's where we've seen a lot of change. But there are towns across our region that are really, taking action. Maybe it's on something small, like allowing accessory dwelling units. Sort of like that's the backyard cottage or the apartment over your garage. Often called like granny flats or mother-in-law apartments. That's a lot of who uses them, and that's been a big part of progress in states like California. But local governments do that all the time. The ARP has a great guide that will help you, as like a local municipality, figure out how to do that. That's something that's already happening. There's towns like Patchogue on Long Island that really have tried to like revitalize themselves and build more housing. And there are local success stories. So the fact that I think that that's an uphill battle doesn't mean it's not one worth fighting. Especially because the great thing about local government is like it only takes a couple people, right? We're set on autopilot in our local governments, especially in sort of smaller suburban ones. So change can be very hard, but once it happens and once there's that momentum, it can happen very fast too. So a little organizing can go a really long way. So I don't think there's any reason to be there's reason to be pessimistic about your prospects at the local level, but there's no reason not to try.
We can be realistic without being utterly pessimistic and feel
Yeah,
helpless about it.
exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And before we go, is there anything you'd like to end with? Anything you'd like to clear up? Anything that you think is worth knowing? Or at least this is probably the thing that people remember the most, the end. People always remember the beginning of stuff and the end of stuff.
Yes. One thing that I think we didn't talk about, you brought up the Fair Housing Act, but I think it's important to sort of like close with the Fair Housing Act as well, which is to say that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing markets, but it also puts a duty on us, on governments, to affirmatively further fair housing, right? So this conversation that we're having isn't just because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the law. This hasn't been enforced very much, but most towns, counties, the state have an affirmative obligation to make fair housing a reality in our state. It's a statutory obligation from the federal government, and it's one that we should take seriously. New York has a real chance to do this. We haven't acted, but that means we get to learn from our neighbors. It means we can catch up. It means there's work to be done, and I think now's the moment.
Okay. Well, I can't end this better. So thank you so much, Noah, for coming in and basically giving us a lesson on the history and the mechanisms of exclusionary zoning.
Oh, it was really my pleasure.
You have truly elevated the conversation because this stuff can be very confusing and very dense.
That is true.
So thank you for coming.
All right.
Stay healthy and stay warm.
You too.
All right. Thank you. You too. Bye.